Good afternoon and welcome to CEC EduStart lecture. In fact, today is the second part of our two-part series on new institutionalism. The first part I delivered earlier. In second part of this discussion on new institutionalism, what I intend to do is to have a look at the three main schools which are basically associated with this entire idea of new institutionalism. In my first part of the lecture, I had mentioned that what was the context in which this new institutionalism emerged. In fact, one thing is very clear and that should be kept in mind, that there are a lot of difference between new institutionalism and old institutionalism. The context in which the challenges to institutionalism as a institution, as a unit of analysis, an entire approach which was associated with traditional institutionalism. We have discussed earlier that how behavioralism, post-behavioralism, structural functional analysis, system theory, all of them question this entire approach which was associated with this institutional studies of politics, which included of course a study of constitution, law and so on and so forth. What has happened over the years, that there has been revival of interest in institutions, and this is perhaps the hallmark of this entire new institutional revolution in political science, which is known as new institutionalism. In fact, it should be kept in mind that institutional structures develop a code of behavior. For example, this British practice or adage saying that once a speaker always a speaker basically is suggestive of that code. So therefore, in fact, institutions are always there, but what importance you attach to institution, that is important. This traditional approach is comparative politics, focused mostly on institutions, initially not in comparative perspective, but later of course a comparative perspective also developed when institutions from different countries were compared and surveyed, and accordingly certain conclusions were drawn. But still it was completely insulated from the social process. Social and other aspect of institutions were not considered significant. But what has happened over the years, that social variables, economic variables, and when I talk of social variables, that include the cultural variables as well, were also factorized, and it was basically argued that politics cannot be properly understood unless you take into account the societal factors. For example, earlier the traditionalists used to study state and state institutions, but never considered a state in relationship with the civil society. But later on these limitations were highlighted, and accordingly we find that traditional approach was subjected to rigorous criticism, and that was the context in which this behavioral, post-behavioral, structural functional system and all these approaches developed in comparative politics. But what is so significant about a new institutionalism? Because one thing is very clear, that the purpose of this new institutionalism is a normative concern with improving the political system. In fact, it is also argued that institutions develops through interaction, particularly learning and deviating from both types of both traditions and practices in society. So therefore, this entire slogan that institutions matter have basically heralded a new revolution in comparative politics, which is basically known as new institutionalism. Now, one thing is there for all of us to remember, that this entire new institutionalism is not very homogeneous in terms of its approach. There are three main schools which are associated with new institutionalism. Of course, what is hard institution, what is soft institutions, how institutions developed, all these issues we had discussed in our first part of the discussion. But these three schools, which are essentially basically the flag bearer of this new mood, intellectual mood in comparative politics, which we call new institutionalism, and these schools are very important in terms of the development and in terms of the ideas which have basically surfaced over the years, particularly in name of new institutionalism. The first is the rational choice institutionalism, the second is a cultural institutionalism, and the third is of course structural institutionalism. So, these are the three schools which are basically associated with this entire concept of a new institutionalism. In fact, in my earlier lecture, of course, I had referred to new institutionalism, particularly the first important school, that is rational choice institutionalism. But what happened in our earlier discussion, that we only referred to this rational choice institutionalism, that how it is perhaps a very important theoretical school which basically argues for revival of this entire institutional method in comparative politics. Now, to begin with rational choice institutionalism, then of course, we will take up cultural institutionalism, and subsequently we will move to a structural institutionalism. One thing is very clear, that in this entire new institutional discourse, the three schools which are often referred as the key schools so far as this entire approach is concerned, you find the imprint of three different branches of social science on these three schools. In rational choice institutionalism, we find lot of impact of economics, particularly the neoclassical and classical economics. Similarly, on cultural institutionalism, we find lot of impact of sociology and social anthropology, particularly Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, and so on and so forth, particularly in terms of formation of values, how culture cultural moorings become a very important setup under which individuals and institutions operate, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the structural institutionalism is heavily imprinted or indebted from history, or some scholars who have use historical understanding about politics, about institutions, and about society. So, therefore, we find the imprint of these three important branches of social science on these three schools. Now, this rational choice institutionalism, as we were discussing earlier in my first lecture, is basically also referred as methodological individualism, because methodological individualism is one tradition which is not new to political science as well, because the classical liberalism argued about this methodological individual, and that how individuals and their behavior are important, and how individuals' rights, individuals' freedom, they were the chief concern of the political theorists in the formative phase of liberalism or the modern society. But this methodological individualism, when it comes to comparative politics through this rational choice theory, essentially talks of preferences and behavior of individual, that how preferences and behavior of individuals matter. But one thing should be kept in mind here, that when we talk of behavior, the focus or study of behavior in this methodological individualism is not the same as perhaps it is done within the behavioral study. It is in different terms of it is in a different sense that behavior and preferences are analyzed by methodological individualists who are basically championing this rational choice theory. In fact, there are certain premises of this theory which is very important. One is that every individual is a rational agent in society, and therefore, individuals pursue their own interest, and therefore, individuals are seen as a calculative, a strategizing agent. Particularly, this is the model on which perhaps the classical economic theory operates. Now, this theory also argues that because of this because of the nature of individuals, they interact with other individual players, and in that process they seek to maximize their gains and achievements, particularly in terms of the goals that they set for themselves. So, therefore, there are three important assumptions, that individuals are rational agents, and number two, they have certain goals and they try to maximize those goals and minimize the cost. So, this is perhaps the model on which this entire approach is built. Of course, we will see later that how institutions come into the picture, because what is the relationship between such calculative rational individuals acting in social settings with the institutions, what institutions have to do here. And therefore, because this new institutionalism, the important reference point must be institution in one way or the other, because we are not discussing here purely the economic model of rational choice theory, where perhaps the institutions may be of secondary importance, but nonetheless institutions are also important there. For example, Adam Smith, the classical economist who still continues to be very source of inspiration for this rational choice theory, even Adam Smith gave importance to institutions, that the choices can be properly organized, structured, where not only individual interest, but the social interest can also be served only if you have the proper structuring of institutions. And Adam Smith particularly gave importance to two institutions, property and the market. So, therefore, a rational choice theory focuses on the interest of individuals and the actors in society, and particularly how institutions affect the behavior, pattern of behavior of individuals is also important reference point for this theory, and this is how this gets associated with new institutionalism. So, therefore, we need to, according to this theory, you need to identify actors' goals and its maximization, and particularly the rational outcome and its relationship with institutions. Now, of course, this rational choice institutionalism, as I was mentioning, applies a microeconomic model of rationality to the analysis of collective choices that are made in the political process. So, therefore, one thing is very clear, that human action and particularly the way it tries to analyze human behavior in the micro context, not the macro context, but micro context, that how a rational actor acts to achieve certain goals, and in that process how it tries to maximize its gain and minimize its loss. Of course, rational choice theory also has certain other assumptions, and that is perhaps important from the point of this new institutionalism, because it is also argued that since individuals or actors are rational, therefore they cannot be left to the logic of unregulated situation, because unregulated situation may lead to a situation where individual interest may be served, but not necessarily the social interest. So, how to have a situation where both individual maximizes its goal and gains, as well as the social welfare is also achieved. So, this bringing some sort of harmony, balance between individual gains and the social gains, perhaps is the important contribution of this rational choice theory, particularly the way neoclassical economic theorists, economics and particularly the theorists associated with, have argued, that we will basically discuss later. So, therefore, what we find that the puzzle of this new institutionalism, as I was mentioning, is with the rational choice argument, that how individual choices can promote common good, because we cannot assume that every rational act of individual meant to promote or seek his or her goal may lead to the promotion or or enhancement of common good. So, therefore, how that social well-being as a common good can be achieved. So, this is perhaps one of the puzzle, and it is here the contributions of Putnam and others, particularly in terms of the theory of social capital, also becomes important in terms of this entire balance between individual and the social good. So, therefore, rational choice theory is one important school of thought so far as new institutionalism is concerned. The focus of rational choice theory, of course, is purposeful individual and his motivation and beliefs. And particularly this motivation and beliefs are not something which is coming from inside, but basically meant only to promote his or her goals or her gains. Now, the argument of methodological individualism, as I was mentioning, that individual always make deliberate and rational choice, particularly in pursuit of their goals. So, this deliberate and the rational choice is one of the basic assumption of this methodological individualist, particularly this this rationalist, rational choice institutionalism, as I was mentioning earlier. Therefore, in fact, this school also argues that even if action is collective, or even if the action takes place in the collective setting, but nonetheless the basic unit of analysis is individual, because after all the collectivity is also the combination of individual interests and individual action. So, therefore, centrality of individual is the hallmark of this this entire school, which is associated with this rational choice theory. Of course, one thing is also important to remember so far as this rational choice theory is concerned, that what is the nature of this individual choice. Particularly from the point of view of the ontology of this rational choice is also important for this school. Now, what is this rational choice ontology? Now, according to this theory, the rational choice ontology implies that individuals are self-centered or self-interested, and therefore, they always act to achieve their personal goal, and in pursuit of that goal they act as a maximizer who seeks the biggest possible benefit and least cost in decision. So, this cost benefit analysis is basically centered to this entire analysis. Now, one thing is important, the chosen course of individual's action according to this theory affected by the changes in structure of costs and benefits at margin. So, therefore, whatever choice is made by an actor according to this theory ultimately is influenced or affected by the cost and the benefit at the margins. So, therefore, in fact, the marginal principle theory gets applied here, which says that other things being equal, any increase in cost of a action will essentially decrease the chances of that action taking place. So, therefore, this human nature, human psychology, that it always weighs costs and benefits. So, this any even if other variables, other factors are similar or the same, but any increase in the cost of action would essentially decrease the chances of a particular action which was responsible for increase of cost not to happen or recur again, particularly if human beings have control on their action. So, this is one basic assumption, that how to minimize and cut the cost and how to increase the gains. Now, how institutions matter, that is perhaps significant from the point of view of this new institutionalism as a approach in comparative politics. Institutions matter in this entire situation where individuals are seen as rational, cutting on their cost and increasing their gains, but institutions come into picture, because for rational calculation different institutions for this rational choice theory, it is important that how different institutions affect the patterns of cost and benefits, because this cost benefit can happen differently under different institutions. Some institutions may be responsible for minimizing the cost and increasing the gains, some institutions may be responsible for increasing the cost and minimizing the gains, and therefore, these institutions which are basically responsible for minimizing the cost would be important from the point of view of the such calculative individuals, rational individuals who are basically out to maximize their gains. So, this is one important argument which basically tie this entire thing with this entire institutional format of society, particularly political institutions, and this is how these political institutions come into picture, and this is how this entire economic model, which basically is important model for economic theory, comes into play so far as the comparative politics and study of politics is concerned. So, therefore, basically institutions come into picture in terms of providing incentive structures, particularly for political action, that how those incentive structures, how individuals' actions take place in context of certain institutional practices, and those practices which are responsible for promoting individual basically gains, rational actors seeking to enhance his or her gain, and certain institutions are promoting it. Now, of course, these different incentive structures, particularly in terms of the action faced under different regimes, fundamentally affect the outcome of political process, and this is how this entire model is basically imported from economics to political science, particularly comparative politics, to analyze the working and functioning of institutions and how they affect individuals' life chances, particularly in terms of maximization of gains and minimization of losses. Of course, the key factor in this entire school, that is rational choice theory, so far as this new institutionalism is concerned, is that individuals always make their choices in same way. That is, there is no change in human behavior. So, rather some sort of generalization is also made by this entire this thing we had discussed earlier, that how institutionalism is a code of behavior, etc., etc. And then also we mentioned that how reaction against system theory, against this old institutionalism happened through system theory and structural functionalism, and then how this new institutionalism has started, particularly this three schools, that is rational choice, cultural institutionalism and structural functionalism. Now, this rational choice theory therefore always argues that individuals make their choices in the same way, and because they make the choices in the same way, that is minimizing the cost and maximizing the gains, therefore some sort of generalization is also possible. It is a different matter that rational choice theory does analysis at the micro level, but nonetheless it often seeks to make macro generalization on basis of human nature. This is how perhaps the liberal political theory also did, that how it generalized the human behavior and how they built a model of politics, that politics is essentially mediating conflicting interests in society, that how there are conflicting interests because of human nature, and because of those conflict of interest, politics emerges as an instrument or as a mechanism to mediate those conflicting interests. This is how the liberal view of politics perhaps was understood. So, therefore, even the this rational choice theory builds a argument on this premise, and then often argues that individuals always act in a particular way, and that way we have already seen that minimizing the cost and maximizing the gain. Now, of course, institutions, as I was telling, that for them is important, because the outcome of these choices always are determined by the institutions that are present in particular society. So, therefore, the interrelationship between institutions and individual is the reference point of this entire school, so far as this new institutionalism is concerned, that individual as a rational actor acting to maximize the gain is not the only reference point for this study, but the main focus is that how it is affected by institutions, how they get linked with the institutions, how institutions come into picture, and how institutions facilitate or obstruct this entire process of maximization of gain and minimizing the cost. So, therefore, this entire discourse basically revolves around this study of institution, and therefore, this revival of institutionalism, because earlier this entire institutional framework was discarded. Particularly, we have seen in context of the behavioral revolution that human behavior was the subject of study, but human behavior, the rules of human behavior were being studied without having any reference to this institutional setup under those institutions under which those behaviors behavioral patterns of human beings surface. But here in new institutionalism, we find that individual behavior of course argued differently from behavioralism, as I have mentioned, as a methodological individualist framework of rational actor, but nonetheless institutions are brought into discussion, that how institutions impinge on human action in terms of their basically facilitating the gains of a rational actor in a given situation. Of course, the influences I have mentioned earlier, that there have been many influences. Adam Smith, of course, has in his invisible hands of the market in his classical writing, classical book Wealth of Nations, and of course, a number of other classical and neoclassical economists have been the source of inspiration so far as this new institutionalism, particularly this rational choice school of new institutionalism is concerned. Of course, Adam Smith had argued that the pursuit of self-interest does not always provide best results, and therefore, in fact, he had emphasized the crucial role of institutions like private property and market. Neoclassical economic theory has developed further a more sophisticated framework to balance individual self-interest and the social good. For example, how self-interest a self-interested behavior in a market situation, self-interested behavior of an individual in a market situation can generate outcome which can be beneficial to the society as a whole. And therefore, in fact, this entire puzzle, that how individual good and the common good, the social good, how they can be harmonized, has been perhaps one of the important puzzle which this neoclassical economics has sought to solve, and that has basically been responsible for new institutionalism in comparative politics, drawing on those models to build a particular argument with reference to this entire focus on the study of institutions, that individual left unregulated in a market situation may not necessarily lead to the social welfare or social good. It can happen only if you have appropriate format or appropriate framework of institutions to govern those actions of rational individuals. So, therefore, this renewed focus on institution is largely on account of this fact, of this concern of balancing individual interest and the social interest. So, therefore, in fact, in neoclassical theory, neoclassical economics, the concern always has been that in situation of a market failure, how to prevent the loss or particular derailment of the social good or the social welfare. So, therefore, market failure is one thing which is perhaps assumed in such theories that can often happen. But in such situation, how a model of politics can evolve, where perhaps the social interest and the individual interest both can be taken care of. It is in this context that another important issue emerges, particularly from the point of view of this new institutionalism, particularly rational choice theory of new institutionalism, and that is the free rider problem. What particularly free rider problem in collective action. In fact, free rider problem is a well known problem in human history. Particularly free rider problem, that individuals not by by nature not always are inclined to work for social welfare. They are always guided by self interest, and particularly this kind of model or model of human nature is a typical liberal model of human nature, which we have seen from the days of Thomas Hobbes and many other liberal thinkers who basically built their entire model of politics on this selfish nature of human beings, and of course, not only Hobbes, but also Machiavelli and many others in political science. Now, this free rider problem, which perhaps this neoclassical theory, neoclassical economists have addressed, is meant to basically minimize or basically cut on those situations where a free rider problem can happen. For example, one can give the example of free rider problem, because free rider problem is essentially the problem of harmonizing individual interests and the collective good. Now, clean air, for example, for having clean air, because clean air is something which is good both for individual and for collectivity, for the society. But in order to have clean air, what happens that everyone has to contribute. Consuming clean air without making contribution into the provision for provision for having clean air is basically a symptomatic of this free rider problem, because if everyone starts feeling that everyone is contributing for clean air, and if I basically do some pollution, how it is going to matter, because large number of people are cleaning it. So, even if I pollute it, it is not going to matter. But such things if are being thought by more and more people, then ultimately what happens, the air would remain unclean. So, therefore, this free rider problem, that not contributing to the larger good is a kind of symptom which is associated with with human nature and human behavior, and therefore, such situations are basically visualized and factorized in such analysis, particularly by this neoclassical model, neoclassical theories, and this is how this new institutionalism also new institutionalism draws on the resources of neoclassical theories and so on and so forth. So, therefore, in fact, this rational individual and his viewpoint and his action which becomes irrational for the collectivity this is the kind of problem which is, one can say, is a problem of free rider problem, that something which is rational may be rational from the point of view of individual interests, but it is irrational from the point of view of society. So, therefore, how to harmonize the two things, that individuals rational action remains rational for individual as well as for society, and this is perhaps the problem associated with the free rider problem, as I was mentioning. And it is in this context that neoclassical economists talks about principal and agent problem. Now, the principal agent problem is largely on account of this controlling this free rider problem, which of course in economics often emerges due to the market failure, but in politics it can emerge because of absence of any control mechanism through which this rational calculative individual action is not kept under check or is not monitored in such a way that the social or the general welfare is not hampered and affected. Now, this principal agent problem is monitoring the relationship between individual actions between among individuals as well as within the organization. So, basically this principal agent problem is a problem of harmonizing self interest and responsibility. The free rider problem is basically of shirking this responsibility altogether. In fact, not shouldering the responsibility and the social burden and simply trying to guided by his or her self interest. So, shirking responsibility is the major issue associated with free rider problem, and for this principal agent analogy is often given by this theory, that is the rational choice theory. For example, in context of a business organization or a company, they would say that the stakeholders in the company are the principal and who basically monitors the activities, and the managers are the agents. So, managers are basically, and their activities are monitored by the stakeholders. Similarly, in politics, they would say that the voters are the principals and the politicians are the agents. The manner in which the stakeholders monitor the activities of managers, in the same way voters basically keep an eye on the activities of politicians, and this is simply, this relationship is important because this is how the self interest and the responsibility are harmonized. So, therefore, the major issue of collective good, that how, first of all, there is no dispute within within the theory that human beings are rational and their behavior is always rational in whatever context they operate. The rationality would dictate the entire action, which would be meant to basically increase the benefit and minimize the cost. But the only thing is that such behavior, such action, how basically gets harmonized with the larger social good, and therefore, in order to harmonize the individual action and the social good, they try to bring in number of arguments, including the free rider problem, which they are alive to, because they feel that free rider problem can often happen, and therefore, this has to be checkmated. So, therefore, the prime concern of rational choice theory is the collective good, particularly since this neoclassical economics and others, as I have mentioned, that have contributed significantly on this issue. So, therefore, the prime concern of rational choice theory, to sum up, one can say, is a concern with the collective action along with the individual action. The principal agent problem in political process, as I mentioned, the voters and the politicians, that how one can check the other, and how different institutions help reduce the increase of such dilemmas, that how institutional framework, institutional format is important in order to check such tendencies coming up, such tendencies developing, where social interests are sacrificed for promotion of individual interests. So, therefore, this entire rational choice theory is geared toward this mission, particularly from the point of view new institutionalism, that how institutions matter, how institution can facilitate, first of all, in cutting the cost, number two, harmonizing individual interest and the social interest. Of course, Marker Olson's the classical work, the collective action, published in 1961, is perhaps the very significant piece of writing so far as this rational choice theory is concerned. But subsequently, many theorists have pitched in, and particularly from the point of view free rider problem and harmonizing individual interest and the social good, particularly social responsibility. And it is in this context that I was referring to Robert Putnam, particularly his entire social capital theory, that how social capital is important, the generation of social capital, which is perhaps responsible for harmonizing this sort of thing, individual interest and the social interest. Of course, dealing with the free rider problem has been the chief concern of this rational choice theory, of course, in recent years, and therefore we have seen that how they have analyzed various institutions in terms of raising and lowering the cost of collective action and overcoming the free rider problem, particularly in context of human action. Now, what we find that this rational choice institutionalism, which we have extensively discussed, now takes us to some other schools of thought, particularly this cultural institutionalism and structural institutionalism, because these are two other variants of new institutionalism which deserve discussion for any understanding of this new approach in comparative politics. Now, what we find that this cultural institutionalism is as rational choice institutionalism is heavily indebted to economics. Is there any question? Yes.
Hello.
हाँ बोलिए. Yeah, I will stop for a while and I will take this question. Yes. बताइए.
From Varanasi.
Hello.
Yes, sir. I have a question. Can I ask?
हाँ जी बताइए.
Sir, I want to ask how new institutionalism is. Hello.
हाँ बोलिए, हम सुन रहे हैं.
How new institutionalism strengthen democracy and how new institutionalism support democracy.
How institutionalism support democracy? Yes, new institutionalism support democracy in the sense that it talks of those institutions which facilitate both the individual and the common good, because the democracy, it is argued, that cannot survive simply on basis of promotion of individual interest and individual good. So, there has to be some harmony between individual good and the social good, and therefore, this entire new institutionalism is geared towards achieving a purpose, achieving a goal in which entire institutional setup should be visualized in such a manner that this harmony is created, this balance is created between the individual interest and the social interest, social welfare. This is what I was trying to mention in context of this rational choice institutionalism. Now, we will discuss more about this when we move to the two other schools of thought, that is cultural institutionalism. The way new rational choice institutionalism is heavily indebted to economics, the cultural institutionalism as another school championing the cause of new institutionalism is heavily indebted to sociology and social anthropology, particularly Weber, Parsons and others. In fact, unlike this rational choice institutionalism, which is also known as methodological individualism, the cultural this cultural institutionalism is known as methodological holism. Instead of individual, the focus is on the collectivity, society, culture. So, therefore, what happened? The role of ideas and beliefs become important here, not interest, as it happens in the rational choice theory. In fact, what happens that it is argued according to the cultural institutionalists that people make decisions that reflect primarily the ideas and beliefs shared by community, and not only interests, but how the belief system also plays equally important role in their behavior. So, actors do not necessarily agree on all ideas and beliefs, but action essentially according to this theory is informed by the reference to the common set of practices and norms. So, therefore, these cultural institutionalists have been arguing for factorizing or giving importance to ideas, beliefs, cultural mores and so on and so forth in terms of the development of institutions and in terms of understanding the behavior of individuals, unlike rational choice theory, which only is guided by the consideration that rational individuals act in order to promote their selfish interests. So, therefore, individual perceptions in fact, according to cultural institutionalism, is a product of the social environment, and therefore, this methodological holism, as I was mentioning, is meant to convey this thing, that how the social context is important for human behavior. So, therefore, one can say that in terms of argument, the cultural institutionalist would say that meaning, symbol and the practices derived from the cultural environment define interest of the people, and number 2, the people internalize cultural norms and do not subject them to rational scrutiny as perhaps the rational choice theory would make us believe. And third thing, that decisions affected by the cultural norms, all decisions of human beings are affected by the cultural norms in which they operate. So, therefore, these are the 3 important arguments of the cultural institutionalist. Why institutionalists matter? For the cultural institutionalist, institutions are embodiment of cultural values and beliefs, not they are seen from the point of view of promoting human interest or promoting the benefit and cutting the cost. Now, parliament and other things are seen as the product of history, not the product of interest. Similarly, we find that apart from the cultural institutionalism, there is a third school. Because for cultural institutionalism, nationalism, patriotism, religion, struggle against oppression, all these things are seldom driven by rational calculation, rather they are influenced by the emotional response to the shared meanings that define human identity in society. So, therefore, this is cultural institutionalism. The third is perhaps the structural institutionalism, which is equally important, and here the contribution of Theodore Skocpol and Barrington Moore are quite significant. Of course, structural institutionalism is divided into 2 schools, the Marxist and the non-Marxist, because structuralism is one argument or one approach which is associated with Marxism as well. Particularly Marx, as a great structuralist, often talked about the structural constraints on human behavior. In fact, some of the Marxists like Althusser and Polonjas later on built on this Marxian tradition of structuralism, but within the non-Marxian tradition, Skocpol and Barrington Moore have played important role. And particularly, Barrington Moore's Jr., his book Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, where he studied France, England and and Germany, and similarly Theodore Skocpol, whose writings over the years have also played important role in terms of promotion of a new understanding about institutions, where unlike cultural institutionalists, neither belief nor value system is emphasized, nor unlike rational choice theory only interest calculation is emphasized, but rather historical process of evolution of institutions are basically given attention to. Theodore Skocpol basically looked at that how different structural dynamics of a state played important role in important revolutions. It was not the class interest, it was not the cultural moorings of the people, rather the internal dynamics of the state structures and institutions have contributed. So, therefore, Theodore Skocpol, who is credited for bringing the discussion of state back in, of reviving the interest in institutions and heralding this new approach, that is new institutionalism, particularly from the point of view of structural institutionalism, is quite significant from the point of view of new institutionalism as a method in comparative politics. I will stop here.